Hello fellow skeptics, I'm Luther Name, and this is the 23rd video in the arc addressing the broad issue of is something wrong with physics, what is wrong, and can it be fixed? Now in the prior video I talked about an additional element of what I consider to be an area where I expected to have pushback, and it turned out to be an area which basically addressed the underpinnings to Einstein's relativity, mainly both his special and general relativities, because Minkowski had reformulated his special relativity, but also formed the underpinning from being able to address space-time, which was a four-dimensional space, and as a result of Minkowski's work. And what I discussed was that Minkowski's work was basically flawed, and what he did was not legitimate. So it undermined the total credibility of all of the relativities, both the special or restricted and the general relativity of Einstein. However, I also got a bit into the underpinnings of the environment within academic physics and where it came from, and so that's what I'm going to touch on here fairly quickly, going through some historical underpinnings to the modern university. I alluded before to a book by Walter Isaacson, Einstein, His Life and Universe. You can use that to get a feel for the environment in Europe when all this discovery of what we now call modern physics was occurring. And the universities were organized much differently than they are in the United States. There was a diaspora because of the violent political situation in Europe. And in the 1920s and 30s, mostly in the 30s, you had this vast diaspora of scientists of high skill and repute migrating to the United States and populating our various universities. When World War II rolled around, it was Leo Szilard who had invented the idea of a nuclear reactor and consequently the concept of a nuclear weapon. And he basically began to talk to various people who were politically connected in order to create an awareness that there was possibly an existential technology that needed to be looked at. I don't know whether he got in contact with directly Vannevar Bush, but Vannevar Bush was one of the true early movers and shakers who moved between science, technology, and the political environment in Washington, and he was himself very instrumental in focusing the attention at the beginning phases of the rise of Germany as a technological and military powerhouse. He alerted the political elite in Washington, D.C. about the potential existential threat that this could pose to the United States. So that aside, the United States did ultimately initiate the Manhattan Project. History has been somewhat rewritten as people have written written about the topic of the Manhattan Project itself. The Manhattan Project, just to give it a firmer foundation, was essentially established as a long-term project, not just to ultimately just to build a bomb or a set of bombs, which were in the modern vernacular called tech demonstrators, but was in fact to set up a grand infrastructure to be able to enable the subsequent development of this as a product that could be prototyped and then manufactured reliably. And so the program was intended to continue long after the war, not just to culminate and cease at the stage that was described by the movie Oppenheimer. Very good movie, but historically got some of the facts right, but got the personalities wrong. And the Oppenheimer was not well liked by anybody except other physicists, and he did a good job in moving between the military people who were in charge of the overall project and the group that he was responsible for. But he had no experience in managing large groups and complex projects, and he was a facilitator, and that was his job, and that was why he was chosen, to be an interface he could communicate with and was simpatico with the attitudes of the and academic people who were brought in to actually do the bomb development. And the physicists were the ones who had the mathematical tools and understanding of building complex mathematical models. And so they were the ones who basically took charge of that technical aspect of the development of the bomb, which was its modeling and description. And then in things that are now second nature, modeling what you should see, how to test it, how to measure it, how to interpret what you're measuring. And along the way, we also set up a couple radiation labs. Same name, different functions, just to confuse things among outside observers. A radiation lab at Berkeley was discovering materials that would allow the concept of a bomb, runaway chain reaction, as Szilard had identified it. And then there was another radiation lab that is now called Lincoln Labs, which is associated with MIT. And they were looking at technologies of various types to move them, many things that were academically of interest and had been poorly looked at, into what would be called technology for use in the tactical aspects of the war, such as microwaves, radar, and other things, control systems, things that were important in actually developing technology that could be deployed. There were a great number of physicists involved, and this is kind of a core issue because these were experimental people. While some of them were, you would call them theoreticians, good with paper and pencil, there were some who were good experimentalists, and there were some inventions of some repute that came out of that as they developed technology for various tactical systems that proved useful in the war. And not to be left out, though, is that many universities, including Harvard, had excellent programs that were converted into or were developed to within the physics and other science areas within the universities to identify technologies and to do the work that was needed to give many of the things that were being considered a firm underpinning in terms of what they were, what was being described, and how they could be applied into technology. So, but coming out of the war, we knew that Russia was going to be our main adversary, going to be our future existential threat. And they embarked on a program of what they called training hundreds of thousands of people in what we now call STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And they were going to do that. And our intelligence in terms of their capability of doing this was not all that great, but we knew that everybody was afraid that there'd be another technology like the nuclear bomb that could be discovered if somebody just dug deep enough or looked hard enough to find it. So the United States needed to embark on that same kind of program to compensate for that. Didn't want any technological surprises. And to that end, we basically did something that was very unique. We began to incentivize both industrial and academic organizations to do more contract research in various technologies and science areas, and the universities themselves were now tasked not so much to do the technology, though a few were, and they did some fantastic development work by putting together programs. I myself started work up at the University of Michigan, where under one of these programs called Project Michigan, go figure, developed a piece of technology. Well, actually developed several technologies, or played a major role in several technologies. One is remote sensing from satellites or aircraft, and the other one was called synthetic aperture radar. And I would point people to the Wikipedia article on synthetic aperture radar, because this was a true tour de force in terms of the transition of what was pure physics into modern electrical engineering terms, antennas, radiation propagation, radar, and signal processing associated with that. And in fact, holography grew out of that. The first practical application was of holography to basically do the signal processing for the synthetic aperture radar. And I leave it to you to read the Wikipedia article on exactly how that worked. So that there were a great number of programs that were enabled by the U.S. government after World War II, and one of which was the program to train all these STEM scientists. And I was one of the many people that took advantage of the particular program. My funding came through NASA with no strings attached. I didn't have to go into any of the types of programs that were relevant to NASA's charter. But when I graduated in 1970, and I alluded to it in the prior video, there were a lot of physicists who had been trained in various niche areas with that same idea that, well, there's no caveat in terms of what we wanted you to do, just become a PhD physicist to be able to address these problems. They couldn't find work. And many of them, a great number of them, subsequently left physics completely because they couldn't find any work. So one of the things I also mentioned was the book by Anne Finkbinder. It was called The Jasons. And in The Jasons, she portrays academic physicists as having an attitude that they can solve any problem from first principles. Well, they can't. And they don't even know what the first principles are. But what they did do and what they can do is they can address any problem. And it was that particular fearlessness, intellectual fearlessness of saying, yeah, I'll look at it. I don't know exactly how to solve it at this point, but let's look at it. It's an interesting problem. It was, and this is key. It was an attitude. Not that I can solve any problem, but that I'm willing to look at any problem. So Anne Finkbinder kind of dances around that. So what you had in the post-war era was this spinning up of all sorts of groups to create organizations, both academically and non-academically, to do research and development in areas that were deemed critical. Some of this occurred within certain universities, but most universities were not able to actually develop that particular capability at that time. And so it was only a few universities that got programs like the University of Michigan. Others, University of Illinois had it, Harvard had it. Of course, there was at Berkeley, the schools that we don't normally associate with doing research and development associated with military and defense types of applications. But they did then. And out of that grew organizations that were doing contract R&D. We developed the whole notion of what contract R&D was, how it would be done. And a lot of it was built on the idea that you saw it in the way Japan was rebuilt, and of course we needed to rebuild Europe in the same way because the communism did present itself as an existential threat to what we call the Western way of life. Well, certainly democracy, or at least our more free forms of government that we had in the West. And of course, the academic institutes within Europe had been totally torn down and broken up during the war, with the exception of England, perhaps, and the United States. So after the war, these organizations were remade, and as technology became more important, as we need people to address this whole STEM, or the concept of STEM in the United States, you now had the universities reformulating around not just their standard technology and engineering or even scientific disciplines, but fragmenting into what you would call technology sections. You had people looking at computers later on, you had people looking at various other topics. You even had many topics that were overlapped between what the academic physicists were looking at, which was who were mechanical engineers and who were electrical engineers, and they were looking at some of the same problems. One was things like atmospheric electrodynamics, the idea of auroras and atmospheric, ionospheric events and factors, the physics of what was occurring, and that is still going on. And so you had everybody within the universities, not everybody, you had various people within the universities who were dealing with a variety of topics that were broad with respect to what their own narrow discipline areas were. And this is a key issue, because during the 1960s you began to see a change where a great deal of the experimental work that was being done within academic physics was now moving off into these technology departments. The people and the disciplines or the sub-disciplines associated with it now became more technology oriented, and they became spun off from the academic physics. The people literally left academic physics and moved into some of these new areas. And so you had a diminution of what constituted academic physics addressing experimental topics and doing experimental work. But you concomitantly had a growth in the theoretical area, especially as computers started to evolve. You now had theoreticians who were able to do computations, modeling that they couldn't address before. And in fact, this continued all up through the 1960s. And by the time the 1970s rolled around, things became accelerated with the gradual diminution of experimental work and a change in the nature of the experimental work, where it migrated to a great extent out of physics and became parts of other areas. Spectroscopy, well, it moved over into areas, biological areas, as well as chemistry. And you began to see the birth of these departments that we now recognize and see as part of modern physics within academia. And later on, when you got to the 1980s, many of the organizations that had been tasked with doing contract R&D began to fold. They faded away, closed up shop. These organizations had been formed in the late 1940s, early 1950s to basically, there may have been some jawboning, but there's also belief that some of these corporations could find technology that would enable new product areas, new business areas that they would want. And so you had companies doing contract R&D and had some very fine research and development types of activities going on. Ford Motor Company and drew heavily on some people from the University of Michigan, had a very good one, but it didn't fit with what they were doing. And in fact, many of these organizations didn't ultimately turn out to fit with their corporate parent, and so they were closed up. But we also developed the national laboratories, basically as a way of supporting what I alluded to in the earlier video on the development, the long-term development of the research and development, prototyping and manufacturing of nuclear weapons and weapons of all type, and looking at other related types of technologies such as plasma and fusion, and then ultimately high-powered lasers is used as elements of the possible enablement of fusion. And so the national laboratories were tasked as part of this large infrastructure to basically support the nuclear energy development effort long after the war. But we also developed other types of contract R&D organizations. I myself was associated with Battelle, and in the early 1950s, Battelle was approached and set up in Germany, Frankfurt, Germany, a facility, and basically helped enable the redevelopment of research and development and technology development in what was really a shattered German academic and research infrastructure, and helped stabilize it and helped bring new life to it and invigorate it. And of course, from that, though I'm not sure how directly the spin-off was, Germany bifurcated into the Fraunhofer Institutes and the Max Planck Institutes, each with a different focus and in competition in some ways with their academic counterparts to do science and technology, research and development. and ultimately Battelle Frankfurt closed up as Germany preferred to fund their own organizations rather than some external organization. But the issue was that these organizations seeded down in Europe the establishment of new ways of doing research and development. Now, the thing to note is that even though these organizations, such as in Germany, were independent and became independent, they were following the model, at least from an academic physics point of view, established in the United States. We all became stale. In the 1970s, starting in the 1970s, and starting, everything that was happening in the United States was essentially happening in parallel in other countries. That the idea of the theoretician versus the experimentalist, the movement into what we now see as the modern organizations, became a total shift from the pre-World War to a structure of academia into the modern version that we see today. And of course, one of the things not to be forgotten, and as pointed out by Ann Finkbeiner, physicists became superstars after World War II. From the work that they did, and as the word slowly leaked out as to the role that they played, with a certain amount of self-aggrandizement thrown into the mix, physics became kind of the go-to discipline within physics and within the STEM research areas.
I, like a lot of people, was attracted into physics as a discipline as a result of the great deal of publicity that had accrued onto the academic physics community because of the work on the Manhattan Project. Now, before going on any further, and this could go on, and I have probably hours of tape where I've thought about the various aspects of academic physics and the background and the history, but I'm not going to go on any further. Everybody is pretty much aware of the fact that not only academic physics, but academia itself is in deep trouble at this particular point. Failing demographics. I think one of the issues with respect to people going into physics, many of them are just going into undergraduate in physics, and which is really not enough physics. And they're very rapidly moving on into the various technology areas and getting their advanced degrees, if any, in these technology-related areas. So the talent pool has been decreased considerably in terms of people going into physics. The job opportunities outside of academia for physicists is not particularly bright these days, and has been winding down for the last 20, 30, perhaps 40 years. The decreasing pool of talent that has been available and who might have been interested in going into physics has now shifted over into the biological areas and many of the technology areas associated with other disciplines, where the role of physics, basic physics, is much less important. So I think the talent pool, the focus, the decrease in experimental work, the change into analytics, and the particular attitude that exists within academic physics at this point has basically caused a stagnation. We no longer get the best and brightest into physics. I think we're like many other disciplines. We're getting some, but not enough. There's a critical mass associated with any of these particular programs. The early years of the largesse from the various government sources, and with a very wide discipline base in the groups that coming out of World War II that were in the technology areas, various science areas, I think what we've done is we've narrowed it. I think unintended consequences associated with funding shifts, priority shifts, and I think that with the pressures that have been put onto academia, they've gone after sources of revenue without a whole lot of regard as to what contributions their efforts are making in terms of improving the technology base of the country. And this is, I think, true everywhere. As the priorities have changed over the last 40 or 50 years, and I think that academic physics has probably experienced a great deal of the brunt of that. That, as they say, the blush is off the rose, or the cachet has faded, and now the new superstars are in the biological areas. But that star will fade too as priorities shift, and as monies dry up, and as the student base going into academia continues to deteriorate, and funding pressures grow up. Everybody's in a protective mode in academia at this point. As I say, one last bite of the apple. The future does not look bright for academia. And maybe the academic physics is just proven to be the canary in the coal mine. It was the first, and now it's basically leading the slow decline and demise that is existing in terms of participation, payoff, and returns on an investment that's occurring. So from my perspective, from a historical perspective, I think that we have been experiencing in academic physics unexpected, I would say unintended consequences, but perhaps inevitable consequences. And I think that if we want to remake either academia or academic physics into something that is more rewarding, has a higher degree of payoff, then we're going to have to completely remake it. And those people who basically are hanging in there for the last bite of the apple have got to go. And the whole environment itself has to be shifted. I think there will still be a role, I think, for the liberal arts types of universities, those that we envision from bygone era, the hallowed halls of Ivy, as it were. I think there's still a role for some of these schools, but the smaller ones are going to disappear, and the total enrollment in universities is going to decrease. You know, the strange thing about university enrollment was, even when I enrolled back over 50 years ago, the number of people that would basically make it from their freshman year into graduating, undergraduate even, it was only 50%. So even though college education was really very, very affordable back in the 1950, 1960 time frame, and there were lots of opportunities of people to take advantage of it. Taking advantage of it, still only half of them made it. And who knows how many of those were actually contributors in some sense to the growth in the body of knowledge associated with whatever discipline they got into. They really didn't get into the PhD program until the STEM programs funded by the government to basically encourage the development of more technology people and STEM people with PhDs and advanced degrees of various types. Until that came along, why the undergraduate enrollment has always been kind of flat. The participation has been somewhat flat. The success rate has been somewhat flat. Nothing really has changed, except that there are more people now. When you have a country that has only 150 million people, and then it doubles to 300 million people, well, then you wind up having to either increase the size of each individual institution, or you have to add more institutions. And now that the demographics are shifting, now you have, as happens in many instances, you just have too many people providing services where there are not services needed. And I think that everything is kind of following that particular track. And I'd have to say that perhaps the consequences of tenure, tenure had a role to play, and I think in the early years of the 20th century, I don't think it made any difference whether there was tenure or not, because there was enough growth and enough highly qualified people being attracted into academic and even non-academic careers in science, physics in particular. But I think what happened was, as things changed, you began to have less competence, and you had people who were just hanging in there. We always knew there was deadwood. We always knew that there was a certain period of time where people were productive. They weren't productive for all 40 years of their career. They were productive maybe for the first 20 years of their career. And then they basically were in a kind of a sustaining mode with very little productivity improvements, creativity improvements. Maybe experimentalists in certain areas because they were doing work that could be replicated. You measure something, then you measure something else, and you use the same techniques and the same particular equipment. And so you could basically cycle through the accumulation of data relative to things. But there was a lack of focus in terms of whether or not that had any payoff. We just said, oh, well, it's data. It's like we do now. Our body of knowledge increases exponentially. Well, no. The quantity of paper we produce increases exponentially. The amount of information associated with what's on those has been shrinking and shrinking concomitantly. I think that we've been flat in terms of the actual information that's useful that we've gleaned from our research work. So that's the end of the story. Regardless of the history of academic physics or some of the background associated with how it got to where it is irrelevant. It may be interesting, but the fact is it's not productive. When things are no longer productive, then they've got to be basically taken apart and reformulated to operate in a mode that is more productive, if it can be made more productive. I believe it can. I think there are too many unanswered questions. We're just not asking them, primarily because they're very hard questions and because it takes too long to get answers. And in this soundbite era that we're in, including sound bites with respect to research results, we need to have things that pay off very quickly. And I think that nobody's paying any attention to it. So one of the revamping issues would be to create various environments where you can take the time to delve into some of these very tricky problems. I thought for a while that some of the national laboratories could do that, but even there, they stagnated. Even though they were more technology oriented in terms of their productivity and output, it just never manifests that way. It became bureaucratic, and as we know, anytime the government is involved with the administration of various institutions and activities, we know that ultimately they become bogged down and bureaucratic and stagnate. And so ultimately you have to basically tear them apart. That's all you can do. Tear them apart, start from scratch, and leaving out the bad parts and hopefully identifying and adding new parts in. So with that, I'm Luther Ney. That's the end of this portion of the arc. The next discussion will be with regard to dark matter. It'll be a little bit out of sequence, and I'll be doing something that I said I was not going to be doing, which is basically delving into specific problems and seeing how some of the errors and omissions can be addressed and corrected, and address some of the new problems that have emerged over the last 20 years, 30 years, and are not being properly addressed. And in my mind, dark matter is one of these items, and it has to do with the fact that we got Newtonian physics wrong many, many years ago, and we've continued to get it wrong. And so I'm going to delve into that, maybe one, maybe two additional videos. But I'm Luther Ney. Leave some comments, and I'll talk to you shortly. I know, quit calling me shortly.